You've reached Hotel Pacifico, your 5-star destination for BC politicos. Press 4 for room service. Press the star key for your hosts Mike McDonald and Kate Hammer.
Welcome back, guests. It's a beautiful sunny day at Hotel Pacifico, and it feels like an excellent kind of put your feet up episode. What do you think, Mike?
Well, I'm still recovering from our first live episode we had the other day with civics, and Jeff's spicy take on Brown Maroney. I'm still getting over that, Kate. So I need a more restful episode here where I can put my feet up.
Well, I'm recovering from wearing an actual waistband. I'm back in the elastic waistband and so glad for the soft pants, but we'll muscle through today.
Whatever works. Well, speaking of, comfy furniture to relax on, we're going to have a special guest here today who's been part of the furniture in BC politics for 30 years. It's almost exactly to the day, pretty close, that Mike de Jong took his seat in the legislature after a landslide victory in the Matsqui by-election in 1994 in February, which I had the great honor and privilege of working on full-time during a wintry, snowy campaign period out in the plains of Matsqui Prairie and Abbotsford, and got this guy elected who was barely 30 years old at the time, and 30 years later, he's still there. So I'd like to welcome a man who needs no introduction, BC politics, Mike de Jong.
Well, Michael, Kate, great to be checking into the Hotel Pacifico. If we're talking about furniture, I am very much in the category of antique furniture now. And
I'd say,
yeah, I am. I'm
first of all, you definitely have no aptitude to assemble IKEA furniture. I can tell you that much.
Oh,
are you antique or are you mid-century modern? Let's.
I'm not even, Kate. I'm not even Renaissance, man. I'm that Arborite covered table that you find in your garage that you say, why are we still got this hanging around?
There are no USB plugins anywhere near this piece of furniture, that's for sure.
No.
But that furniture has seen a lot over the last few decades. And to catch up our listeners who may not have been born yet before you were elected, you were elected in a by-election in 1994 and in a contested nomination that you defeated the party favorite who respectable lawyer who was coming back to Matsqui to seek a nomination, a fella who'd been a high school basketball hero at MEI. And along comes this country lawyer who's on the school board. I think you were maybe 29 when you were nominated. I remember being at your nomination meeting, and lo and behold, you brought in the bodies and you won. Back in the day when there were like contested nomination meetings.
Remember that?
So what made you want to run in the first place?
So, Kate, I'm gonna because McDonald, of course, his memory of this is all clouded by.
I believe it.
Right, by
correct the
month
record.
he spent. Yeah, this was a traumatic part of his life, but he's right about the nomination meeting. And I remember Gordon Campbell came out to Abbotsford, and he was pretty tight with the mayor of Abbotsford. Mayor of Matsqui at the time was a guy named Dave Candle, great guy. And Candle had a guy that he relied upon politically for campaign management skills, a local businessman named Dave Holmberg. And Mike got to know both of them. I knew both of them. And Gordon Campbell, then running in his own by-election out in Shaughnessy, had been elected leader of the BC Liberal Party, and they were looking to set up for the next general election. So Campbell comes out, says to Candle and Holmberg, who should we get to run? And Mike's right. A very nice man named Ed Suderman was identified. Very credible in all sorts of ways, very credible candidate. And somewhere along the line, and I don't know if Holmberg had been drinking scotch or whatever the hell was going on, Holmberg says, well, what about this guy, de Jong? And I'd been on the school board for a few years. So I had a chat with Gordon Campbell, and look, at the end of the day, I didn't harbor notwithstanding Mike's brilliance and presence, I didn't harbor a lot of notion or hope for a final result. But my partner in my little law firm and I thought, well, we're going to get a lot of free publicity out of this. Well,
you left him in the dust a long time ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it was, I mean, obviously the drama of that by-election was that you defeated the leader of the Social Credit Party, Grace McCarthy, who'd been an institution of BC politics since the 1960s. And it was seen as a primary as to which party would lead the free enterprise forces going forward. Sound familiar?
Yeah. It's history repeats itself. And of course, what we don't like to think about, those of us who occupy that part of the political spectrum, is it ultimately took a second election to resolve that issue. But the other thing you might recall, Mike, from that experience, it was Grace McCarthy. It was her by-election, and she was the grand dame of BC politics. And I don't say that, by the way, to inflate. There is still, in the local floor of what was the local radio station, a stain on the floor of my blood when she skillfully carved up the kid in a little campaign debate. But she did it with a smile on her face. It was magical. I learned a lot from her in that by-election. But you recall, the leader of every other party you can imagine ran in that by-election as well. There was the Reform Party was emerging. There was the Family Coalition Party. There was everyone you can think of was involved in that by-election.
Can we go back to the bloodstain? I think that's a really interesting story. Just, I'm imagining you as a young lawyer, thinking you're probably pretty well equipped for this, public debate piece, and then coming up against a veteran of the political sphere, and realizing you have things to learn. Like, what do you remember about that day? I mean, was that sort of an important learning inflection point for you?
Okay, it really was, and it wasn't just that day. I mean, that was the day at the radio station, and then a few days later, an all candidates meeting that was like a circus, but in a good way. A Democratic. I was terrified. I remember my buddy Steve, who I was practicing law with. I said to him the next day, "What'd you think?" He said, "Well, you did all right." I said, "Oh, that doesn't sound." He said, "Well, you look like you had a 2x4 up your backside. Like, if you're going to do this, you should have fun. I mean, it's serious what you're doing, but you should enjoy it." And Grace McCarthy conveyed that. She wasn't well. I don't want to say she had a long-term ailment, but I think she had the flu through much of the campaign. But she taught me that much as Christy Clark would do 15 years later, the presentation, conveying to people enjoyment about being around them and enjoyment at the task of public service, and she was incredible.
It's interesting because it reflects a lesson I've seen a lot of new politicians learn, where they can be very accomplished too in different fields, and they come from spaces where sort of, they kind of believe the integrity of their own argument's going to win the day. And they underemphasize sort of the delivery of the message, or how you show up, or how you seem to feel about the message. Am I capturing, I think, some of what that learning was for you? Yeah.
I suspect, Kate, that someone else is, but I summarize this now for my colleagues who agonize over having speech writers produce their stuff. And I try to tell them, look, if it's not your words, it's not going to sound like your words. But I tell them this: people hear what they see and they remember what they feel. People don't remember the words. They remember how a politician or a speaker made them feel. And that is the single most important thing.
Good advice. I want to go back to the blood. Now, I remember in that by-election, you taking me along to a tour of a turkey factory.
You thought it was a dairy plant.
And this is just a tip to all those political staff and advanced people out there. If you're going to go to a turkey slaughterhouse, and you start from the finished end and work your way backwards, it's good not to be squeamish about blood. So as we continue through this tour of Lilydale in your riding. You were having a great time. I was feeling a bit grim as I was seeing the defeathering process and the so I always know where you're heading. That's what I learned from you. know what's on
as,
the agenda.
and to quote Les Nessman, "As God is my witness, I thought turkeys could fly, Michael."
Well,
I'm trying to imagine what
we had a
what
lot
our
of fun.
listeners. Oh gosh.
We had a lot of fun in that by-election. That was really the last close race you had until the last one you had, when things tightened up again. But you've had a good run out in Abbotsford. But let's talk about the legislature and your perceptions of 30 years there and how that's changed. What's the biggest difference today compared to 1994 when you walk through the doors into the chamber?
People might be surprised to hear me say this, but I think it's a far more civil place than it was when I arrived, and that maybe that's also a reflection of my own evolution. I mean, I got here, like you say, as a 30-year-old. The opposition that I became a part of really didn't have the scrappy pit bull-ish type, and that kind of became my role, as you'll recall, initially. But I think today, until recently, some of the structural reforms that have been made have assisted in that, more regularity around sitting hours. I mean, just some common sense, practical structural changes. Now, some of that is eroded. We don't need to get into all of that now, and I'm not here to berate anyone, but some of that seems to be sliding back now. I think that's unfortunate, but quite frankly, for those that look at the debates today and lament some of the passion and the arguments and the loud voices, quite frankly, it's a hell of a lot more civil today than it was when I got here.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's sort of not the take I was expecting. And I guess, do you mean it in the sense of, what the relationships actually are between people, like that kind of like, we'll disagree vehemently and then we'll go for a beer afterwards kind of place? Or because I guess you can kind of pull these discussions apart. There's like the interpersonal relationships between the people in the legislature, and then there's the atmosphere around the debates and the kind of inherent divisiveness sometimes in what the debates we're having. Which one are you speaking to, both or one or the other?
Probably, and probably clumsily, because I do have a bias in this case. And people, what I'll frequently and have heard over the years is people come into question period, they see the very animated exchanges that are taking place, and someone will say to me, we wouldn't expect those grade 7 students that were in the gallery to behave like this. No, that's true, but this isn't a forum for grade 7 students. This is not a debating society. This is a place, thank God, that substitutes for what we see in other parts of the world about how public policy is developed in sometimes a very undemocratic way. And the fact that there are people who have passionate views and differences of opinion and articulate that sometimes elegantly, many times elegantly, sometimes less so, is something that I don't think we should. We don't want to sanitize. I will say, we asked about changes. One of the things that I have spoken to my colleagues about on both sides of the floor, the language is becoming a bit sanitized, and
in a bad way.
Well, in a way, if someone wants to reflect on an idea or tell me in the course of a debate that my idea is ill thought out, is actually kind of stupid, they're entitled to do that. We mustn't try in the context of the debate to make it all polite. It can't all be polite, and I see that, and what oppositions and governments, the tool we have here, those of us that are fortunate enough to get selected by our fellow citizens to come here, the one tool we have to convey ideas or criticize ideas on behalf of the public is language, our words, and we mustn't abuse that tool. but we shouldn't have it constrained, and we shouldn't have it sanitized to fit with someone's notion of what is correct.
Can I pick up on that a bit? Because I think it's interesting. I think I'm thinking of a comment that came up when we were talking to elementary teachers last week, where we were talking about teaching students about politics. And I was reflecting how, particularly my own 10-year-old, when he talks about politics, we'll get into this vernacular of good guy, bad guy. And it's a bit different than like right or wrong, right? Like it's more, there's a moral undertone, I think, to sort of the sides. And I worry sometimes, what that's I worry about what his parents are doing that he's talking that way. But like, I worry sometimes about what that undertone is of that judgment, that when we disagree, you're somehow a bad person. Is that what you're, yeah.
That comes back to your notion of depersonalizing. It's not personal. It's not the fact that I don't like your idea. It should in no way, and doesn't, I think, in any way influence. I have over the years developed friendships with people that have very different political ideas and views than me. But you can, at a personal level, treat people with respect. Now, that doesn't mean at times we haven't had some pretty boisterous exchanges, and that's part of the thing too. But as I say, on balance, we're hearing a lot of talk now about the culture around here. Boy, Mike will tell you, when I got here and just before I got here, people getting chucked out of the assembly. I was one of them. The kind of Dave Barrett was dragged out of here in his chair, and it could be quite a circus at times.
Can I relate that? Because I think, so we're talking about how the legislature has changed. I'm wondering what it looks like for 1994 Mike de Jong to talk to 2024 Mike de Jong. Like, how have you changed?
Yeah, self-reflection is frequently the most difficult thing. I think when I arrived here, I took the role of being the opposition's pit bull.
Yep.
I enjoyed it, and I took it pretty seriously. I think at times I overdid it. I think there were times when my use of language in those days probably was more aggressive than it needed to be, or dare I say, more personal than it needed to be. And as I look back now, that was I think a shorter period of time, but for the first 3 or 4 years, kind of to use the hockey analogy, my team didn't have a scrapper in that sense, someone that Campbell could send over the boards and say, go beat up. And I don't mean that physically, of course, but go rough up one of the other team's guys. And that was my role. That role changed very quickly as we moved closer to the 2001 election.
We often have a saying that, the worst day in government's better than the best day in opposition. But, I think the role of opposition's underrated by many in terms of its importance in ensuring good government and ensuring the accountability and the pressure and the scrutiny is placed on government to not misbehave. So you spent the first 7 years of your tenure at the legislature in opposition, and now you've spent the last 7 years as well. So what are your reflections on being in opposition and the importance of it, and where oppositions can really make their mark?
It's hard work. It's governing is hard, by the way. Mm-hmm. Governing, if I wanted to, what I say to people now, people that have known me the longest tend to tell me, make this observation, that I'm less partisan today than I was 30 years ago. I think that's true. And I think that's largely because after 16 and a half years in government, I understand how difficult it is. And I understand how essential it is. It's easy to be dismissive of government. And I sometimes take people to task because I tell them someone has to make these decisions. I disagree with the decision the government has made, but someone has to make the decision, or we have chaos, or we have anarchy. So I tend to be a little more understanding of the challenges that associated with governing. And on the opposition side, look, far less resources. You've got to be far more resourceful. And it is, at the end of the day, inherently negative. And one of the observations I would say about the people that are drawn into this, again, on both sides of the house, is they're generally not negative people. They're people who want to get things done. And the frustrating component, one of the frustrating components of opposition, is it's difficult to get things done. So you're left holding the government to account, poking holes in arguments, trying to reveal where there is a lack of transparency or what should be believed to be a lack of honesty about different circumstances. And over time, I think if you ask any of the senior members of the present government, some of whom spent 16 years, 12 years in opposition, that's what they would tell you as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's interesting.
Go ahead, Kate. Go ahead.
No, it's interesting because I think it relates to your commentary before just about the divisiveness, because it's interesting. I have the same experience, Mike, where when people are critical of government, even a government I don't agree with, there's sometimes this instinct to describe a decision as what the hell were they thinking? Like, how, and as though a government would make a decision without having some intent, right? Like, of course, governments make bad decisions, but it's not as though they just sit around kind of spuriously, like, not trying to do something. I think I've known a lot of people of different political stripes and who have governed, and I would say I have lots of criticisms of many of them. But one of them wouldn't be that they're not trying to do something. Like, that's a pretty rare flaw in someone who takes the effort to run for office and then gets to the point of being in government. And I'm wondering for you, I want to kind of, again, relate this kind of time question, because I think back to 1994 and your decision as a 29-year-old lawyer to go into politics, and how politicians were viewed then. How is that aged now? Do you know what I mean? Like, how do you feel that there's a different sheen or a different view or a different level of prestige and respect for politicians now compared to 1994?
Well, clever, insightful question again. I always joked that I went from being a lawyer, the second lowest rung of the social pecking order, to a politician. It was at best a lateral shift, but probably the only diminishment. But I would say this regretfully, and maybe I surprised you with my observation about the civility, the civility around the chamber. But I think the public has an even dimmer view of politicians today than they did when I entered. I don't think it's quite as bad as we make it out. And one of the lasting impressions I'll take with me for the rest of my life is how kind people are. And I'll give you an example. Last night my truck wouldn't start. I was stuck in a strip mall. Battery was dead. The number of people, 3 people came over, happened to recognize me. I'm here in Victoria, wanting to help and made kind comments. And I'm not in the news much anymore. But they said, "You're that guy." I said, "Yeah, is that okay?" Right? And,
am I safe? Yeah.
Yeah. And yet they were thankful. They said kind words. So when I say that the public's regard, and who I blame for it, largely I blame politicians themselves. And yes, I believe some of that emanates from the South. I believe when political leaders act abusively, when they use language that is abusive, what they are saying to the public is, that's okay for you to do as well. And so politicians, in my view, in that regard, who have set terrible examples, politicians can't expect their role to be respected if they themselves are not respecting the role.
I'm so glad. Thanks for sharing the dead battery anecdote, because it's telling, because I have to say, like, you have a fantastic resume. You have served this province in a, you know, in a bunch of capacities, including in opposition, which is really important. And then you have a kind of greatest hits of cabinet roles on your resume, frankly.
I'm going to call it that, the K-tel minister.
The K-tel minister.
Was the dead battery a metaphor for your provincial political career? And were you able to restart the battery?
Federally.
Well,
yeah.
Federally. Did you get a federal battery?
Federal battery, yeah.
I may have some hidden jumper cables, but we'll have to talk about that later.
Oh, I love a metaphor with mileage.
So Mike, 16 years in government, and from almost all that time, except for a brief interregnum, you were in cabinet. I'm interested in what you think is the legacy, the high points during that time, and some counter around the failings too. Like, what, looking back on it, how do you sum it up? I know it's hard to do it in a few little sound bites here, but what stands out?
You do it at two levels, right? Because most of us, and I now speak collectively about members of the Legislative Assembly, the trigger for getting involved is generally local stuff. And, you know, we were talking about that by-election. Well, what did I talk about? I talked about local stuff. I talked about the hospital, talked about local infrastructure. And so you're inclined, looking back, no matter how long you're here, to have if you can accomplish some of that stuff, looking through that lens, you go, okay, well, I'm proud of that. This is my community, and I hope I made it a bit better by pushing some of those projects ahead. But then when you have the opportunity to serve in a provincial cabinet, and you look across the province and say, what, if any, good did we do there? I'll do the questions in reverse, Mike, because you know, what are the areas? I think the one area that I look back.
Is that your shoe phone?
The Pavlovian bells are.
The bells. It's the bells of the legislature.
Perfect for Hotel Pacifico.
Okay,
yeah.
You know, we took a very aggressive stance when the NDP government of the day signed the first treaty with the NISCA. We were the opposition. It was the first modern treaty, and it was our job to critique it, and we were very critical. And at times, I think, again, coming back to the use of language, we used language that was perhaps unnecessarily aggressive. And I was wrong. I thought that the NISCA treaty, I was concerned that it would drive greater division, certainly in that part of the province. I was wrong about that. I think the treaty has been a good thing. I think a few years later, when I was up there, it was explained to me how members of the Nisga'a First Nation, for the first time, really were beginning to feel a part of the country and a part of the province. So now we moved on, and people tell me that my name, my signature, is on more comprehensive treaties than anyone alive in Canada right now, because we went on to negotiate with 6 or 7 other First Nations, and there hasn't been a comprehensive treaty since then in BC. So I'm proud of those steps that we made, starting with under Gordon Campbell's leadership and with Christy Clark. I think we made a lot of progress, and there's more progress that needs to be made in a balanced way. Look, I'm proud of the fact that we, surprise, that Christy and our government and her government were disciplined fiscally, and that the proof of that and the proof of the importance of that revealed itself not actually when we were government, but 2 years after we left government and COVID hit. Mm-hmm. Because having paid down the debt, having the AAA credit rating, having the best set of books gave the government of the day more leverage and more ability than any other government in the country to provide the assistance that people did need for a year and a half through that. So yes, I'm proud of that. And I was joking with some of the media guys here the other day. If the worst criticism I have to face in the years ahead is he was too careful with the public's money as finance minister over 5 years. I'll take that. I'll take that criticism.
Do you so fair? But like, if you're sipping your coffee and staring off on the horizon, can you have a moment and be like, maybe we went a little too far. Is there any of that?
Yeah. Well, look, I will be the first one to admit when we went into the 2017 election, the premier comes to you and says, "Okay, where are we at?" And you call in the Treasury branch, and I thought we were looking at for that fiscal year about $1 billion surplus, and so we budgeted on that basis. Don't want to spend it all, and yeah, it's electoral politics. So you're in an election year, and you're looking what can you do? In our case, within the context of maintaining a balanced budget. Turns out the economy was performing even hotter than we thought. I didn't know it was going to be a $3 billion surplus. If we had, we would have had some additional means to return some of that, but we still would have paid down some on the debt, and we still would have operated within a balanced budget scenario, which the new government continued to do for a number of years. It hasn't done so of late. I think that's going to cause us some grief down the road. But sure, I mean, but you operate on the basis of the best information available to you. And look, governments and politicians tend to get in trouble when they ignore the advice and the information they're receiving.
Well, your handling of tax dollars was referred to on the show by Don Wright as a hostage taking of tax dollars. So, and you may recall at some point along the way in the first term of the Campbell government, I think it was Rick Thorpe who used to have those posters, think like a taxpayer, that were all over the legislature. So, I think fiscal conservatism was a hallmark of those years. Certainly something that helped unify the coalition as it was under the BC Liberals, that Liberals, Conservatives could kind of buy into that. Looking forward, what do you think the glue is for the non-NDP side of the spectrum? Like, what are the common threads? Because I mean, fiscal conservatism, yeah, it's still there. Maybe it's going to come back in vogue. I don't know. But what are you looking ahead? What do you think are unifying policies?
Yeah. So good point. I think the pendulum tends to swing fairly predictably over the cycle. And the irony is when fiscal conservatives, after they've been there a while, people tend to take it for granted and start to react against it. And I think we saw that. And then COVID provided the rationale and the excuse for abandoning fiscal conservatism entirely, I would argue. Until the impact of that is felt by families and individuals, I don't think you're going to see it return. But I think it is starting to return because the impact is going to start to be felt. Beyond that, Mike, a little bit of, you'll recall in the tail end of the 1990s, land use decisions. We were talking about the relationship between Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal people and the complications associated with managing the land base in that context. I think that is going to emerge. Look, I think the other, this is economic as opposed to fiscal policy, but our country, I'm going to talk about our country now, is becoming an incredibly difficult place to do business. And money is going elsewhere. And we can pretend that we can be an island of 35, 40 million people on our own. We can't. We need to attract. And if you think about the signals that have been emerging from British Columbia and Canada over the last, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years, they have been signals that say to the rest of the world, we really don't want you here. And we really don't want your money here. And the capital is saying, fine, we'll go elsewhere because we got lots of choices. And that is going to have an impact.
So tell me a bit more about that. Like, tell me, where Where's the billboard that says we don't want your business? And what's the indicator you're tracking to show that that's happening?
Irony is there is no single billboard. No one will ever want to say that. But the cumulative effect of the kinds of issues that have been profiled by government, and people have their own views. And I get some of these things domestically have been popular. But if you say to people, you're not allowed to buy a house here. If you say to businesses, you can present us with that project idea, but you'll be lucky if you get an answer in 5, 6, or 7 years. These are all things that leave an impression on people, and a comparative impression, and they say, okay, well, I can go to another part of the world where they seem pretty happy to see me, and they'll give me an answer on my project within a year. So I'll go there. And we are seeing the effects of that. I mean, again, I don't want to come on the program, and I'm retiring from the legislature, so I didn't want this to be a forum for. But if you think about in BC, 3 of the large projects that have been carrying a significant bunch of the weight in terms of our economic performance, Mike, I guess the question one asks, what's coming in behind that?
You're referring to Site C, Coastal GasLink, and Trans Mountain?
Yeah. And we can, in the absence, I mean, Mike will know, those are LNG happened because Premier Clark and the government of that day said, we are going to make this, we're going to do everything we can to make it happen. And the irony, of course, is it was a year later under a government that dismissed it as folly and a pipe dream that finally saw it cross the finish line and saw the investment taking place. That's fine. That's fine. I mean, that's good for BC. But I don't see that same focus on attracting foreign investment on that scale. And by the way, that was a part of the governing years that I loved. Kate asked about this shift. You've prompted me to think about another shift that has occurred. I grew up believing that part of our job as citizens, never mind as politicians, was to welcome the world, to say to people, come here, come invest here. Expo was about that. Expo was about presenting BC and Canada and Vancouver as this gateway. Come here, and the Olympics were partly about that. And it took me off guard when somewhere around 2017, 18, the narrative started to shift to, actually, we don't want people to come here. And we're more suspicious now of investment dollars that are coming here. And I just believe that
because they're making housing prices higher.
Yeah, well, that was the link. And of course, we now know, as I suspected, it's easier, and governments have been doing this for centuries. It's easier to point at an external foe and blame them than to look in the mirror and say, well, maybe the reason housing prices are so high is because we're not building enough. I remember in 2016 calling the then mayor of Vancouver and asking, he'd been on the radio and he was saying, we have a housing crisis. And that was the new term. And I said to the mayor, I said, how many applications for new homes are there on the books in Vancouver, Metro Vancouver today? And he said, well, I don't know. I said, well, don't you think you should know? Because there's 120,000 that don't require any government money at all. These are 120,000 homes that the private sector wants to build, and they just can't get permission to build them. Now, maybe, some of them shouldn't be built. They're in the wrong place. But, that's our fault. That's our collective fault for why those homes aren't there.
Does this extend to the decision around international students and post-secondary? I mean, it's a slightly different issue, right? I think it's getting at a different type of housing stock. But just to clarify, like, are you reading that kind of, pointing, pointing outside of ourselves for a problem in that policy that's been handed down by the federal government? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a good, I mean, rather than look at the kinds of things that we can do, and to remind ourselves, how lucky are we that we are a jurisdiction that people want to come to? And how do we accommodate that? Now, my parents were immigrants. I understand that we have to be smart about how we, but that there is an energy associated with people who want to come here and improve their lives. And all I'm saying is, if our response to that is to continuously send signals that we don't want you to come here, or we're going to limit your ability to come here, eventually that signal is going to be received, and people will say, well, we'll go somewhere else, and we'll take that energy somewhere else.
It's it is an interesting shift. And it's funny you're reminding me, because I was in Ontario in like 2017, 2018, working on this policy file. And we had almost the complete flip view, because we had kind of mid-sized towns in Ontario that were struggling with population shrinking, and the post-secondary institutions there were like, give us more international students, because it's helping out. It helps the economy functionally, right? Like, and actually sometimes people were coming and staying. And so it's so interesting how quickly we've shifted on this. I want to relate it because you represent Abbotsford West, right? And I want to relate it to your riding, because it's such an interesting riding on this housing policy piece. And I want to ask sort of, what do your constituents express about how they understand this issue and what they're looking for the government in terms of making housing more affordable?
Let's talk about the area firstly. So I'll confess, in my area, people tend firstly to look at this through the lens of government, release us, the private sector, give us access to land space, and we'll address this. And there is a bit of hesitancy around this notion that government is going to build the housing that we need. There is a role, people understand, for the government to play an important role as it relates to disadvantaged folks who are not going to be able to access housing on a market basis. But for the great middle class, the frustration is this: we want to own our own home, and you're making it awfully difficult for us to do that. One of the ways we can own our own home in the west side of Abbotsford is to have a mortgage helper in our basement. Well, we don't want to do that anymore, or we can't do that anymore, because if we end up with a tenant that we think is threatening our family, and it happens from time to time, we can't get that tenant to leave. So government policy is making it very, very difficult for individuals to address their own housing needs. And again, if you let us build more, if you increase the supply, there's going to be more options. And tying, and we're seeing some of this, I have to be fair, we're seeing this connection finally being made, tying those very, very expensive transit projects to the provision of housing is something that we were beginning to do in 2016. It looks to me as if the present government provincially sees merit in that and intends, I hope, to pursue that. You look at Burnaby. I mean, I can't think of too many times when Derek Corrigan and I sat down and raised a pint celebrating common positions on public policy issues. But I'll tell you this, Derek Corrigan understood the importance of having those SkyTrain lines running through his community, and he allowed and facilitated housing to be built along those lines. And you see what you've got now.
Well, Mike, we've been lucky to have you on the show today to mark 30 years in the legislature. And if there is a future chapter, we hope you'll come back on Hotel Pacifico, book a banquet room, hold a
Whatever type
fundraiser,
of whatever type of
we have many rooms here at the hotel.
Well, whatever type of furniture you are, Mike de Jong, I think you fit well in Hotel Pacifico. There's always a place for you.
I was talking to someone we were talking about the Chinese New Year and the zodiac. I'm going to come up with my own zodiac calendar, and it's going to be residential furnishings, right? So I think I'm an ottoman. Or a recliner on my zodiac. We'll see.
We'll put it out to our listeners, the Hotel Pacifico politicos. What kind of furniture is Mike de Jong? And let's we'll invite those responses and bring it back for the next episode.
The two-legged stool.
We're gonna crowdsource this. Well, Mike, thanks a lot. I see that it's past the lunch hour at the legislature. There might be a stampede for the parliamentary cheese plate, so we don't want to hold you up.
I'm going down with Rob Shaw. Apparently, we're hosting the Czech TV restaurant review in the parliamentary dining room.
Oh
this
boy,
afternoon.
I'll have to watch that. Okay.
This is what you do on your way out the door. You become maitre d' to the masses at the parliamentary dining room.
Reconciliation, for most of us, will be a lifelong journey of learning and unlearning. If I've got your ears right now, I'm guessing you're into podcasts. So I'll offer a recommendation that might help. If you haven't already, listen to Connie Walker's Stolen: Surviving St. Michael's. It's an unflinching look at the legacy of Canada's residential school system and at intergenerational trauma. It should be mandatory listening for all Canadians, but if you still need convincing, it won a Pulitzer. It will make you think and rethink a lot of things, and hopefully prompt some conversations and some further learning for you or someone in your life. Because open and vulnerable conversations at home, at school, at work are a critical part of reconciliation and to ending gender-based violence. Sometimes it's a podcast or a book or something small like a pen that gets the conversation going. We'll talk more about those pens in a moment, but today I have an ask on behalf of TELUS that starts with making space for connection and vulnerable conversations. Because as the hometown team for British Columbians, TELUS cares deeply about Indigenous reconciliation. That's why they were the first technology company in Canada to launch a public Indigenous reconciliation action plan. That's why, through investment in communities, they've connected 89,000 Indigenous people to advanced broadband networks across 197 Indigenous communities and committed to connect 20 more by the end of 2025. Which brings me back to the Moosehide campaign. You know, those little square pins we spoke about last week that have prompted about 25 million conversations about ending gender-based violence? Well, this is the second part of the ask, and this is me, again, on behalf of TELUS, asking you to get your organization involved in supporting the Moosehide campaign and its mission to make our workplaces and communities safer and more inclusive. Visit moosehidecampaign.ca to learn more.
Hello. You've reached the Hotel Pacifico Strategy Suite.
Thanks for joining us, Geoff. I hope you got to listen into that interview with Mike de Jong. It was a good trip around.
Mike de Jong unplugged. I mean, he and Mike Farnworth are sort of the two pillars of the historic memory of the legislature, but they both have a similar speaking style. Although I think in Mike de Jong's case, I always thought he was sort of like a Saturn V going off, because if he got up to ask a question, there'd be silence as you waited for the countdown to really click in, and then the little plume of smoke, and then maybe a spurt of flame, and then huge amount of flame and a huge amount of smoke, and then the big rocket going off. And always dangerous if you could see him take off his glasses and furrow his brow and wave them a bit as if he's puzzled by the incongruous facts before him and can't believe that the members opposite could be culpable in such a brazen act of egregious stupidity, that kind of thing.
He's very theatrical.
Yeah. Well,
effectively theatrical.
Courtroom training, or TV style courtroom training anyway. Yeah.
Well, he was always a great fundraising draw for BC Liberals. He'd go around the province and do fundraising dinners, and it was usually 99% comedy routine and 1% serious political message at the end. Well, everybody was full of laughs and booze. But I do recall on the legislature floor one time, I believe the NDP were going on a boat cruise that evening, and he brought in a bomb that had all the wires sticking out and everything, like I think it's a TNT on the side. It was clearly a joke. and said, "Oh, I've got a package here for the NDP to take on the boat cruise tonight." And then everyone got very serious and were outraged at this breach of protocol. And how could he talk about causing damage and injury to the NDP? Anyways, that was Mike de Jong in the 90s.
Well, there was some, in the days of the Glenn Clark administration, there were a lot of strange things that happened during night sittings and stuff, which are for some other show.
But is it? I'm like, my ears are up.
Well, yeah, no, never mind.
Well, they're back in the old days. But Mike mentioned on the interview that, there's now more of a fixed calendar now, even though there's been some tinkering to it. Like Gordon Campbell brought in fixed budget day, fixed throne speech. That wasn't there before. And prescribed dates for the sitting. So you kind of knew it's going to start in early February and end in late May every year. But in the older days, you didn't know exactly when it was going to start. And you didn't know exactly where it was going to end. But they had, I think it was 60 sitting days. And then that's when the allowance for MLAs stopped.
That's when stuff got real.
Yeah. So the minute the allowance stopped and they were on the hook for hotel and food and everything like that, things went up pretty fast.
Summered. Yeah.
But we often had summer sitting, so that it could bleed into the summer, be acrimonious if there's labor strife or things like that, and people would get pretty grumpy in July. That's for sure.
Yeah,
things are a little different now.
Yeah. I really enjoyed talking to Mike. That was a really interesting kind of trip down memory lane, and I want to take us into the current state and talk a bit about nominations, actually. And I want to start with you, Geoff, because there's a really interesting race shaping up for what I guess is George Hyman's old seat, now Little Mountain. It looks like it's going to be a tight race there. Is that your read of it?
Oh, I think it'll be hard fought. George announced, for those who weren't aware of it, yesterday that he was going to, yesterday, day before yesterday. Anyway, he's retiring, and he endorsed Andrea Reimer, former Vancouver City Councillor, 3 terms, and a school board trustee, and many other achievements. That she would be an ideal replacement. She's indicated she's going to stand for it, but so has Christine Boyle, who's a current city councillor, barely halfway through her second term. So the nominating meeting is soon. It's April the 4th, as I understand it.
Oh, wow.
There won't be time for new signups. The existing members will have to figure out who they like.
That's interesting.
And so very quick.
So I wonder who knew that, if anybody knew that's when the meeting was going to be, and knew when the memberships had to be deposited. I wonder.
Well, that's a decision that the party makes. I only learned of it,
scrupulously impartial, I'm sure.
Point Mike's making,
Well, I think the fact that George was prepared to leave had been fairly well known in leadership circles for a while, because there was a canvass of all of the MLAs before Christmas.
Everyone knew there was election coming. Yeah,
and he had been working with Andrea for some time too. It wasn't a snap decision to endorse Andrea, so he's done that. I'm going to support Andrea too, although I don't get a vote. I think she's an outstanding candidate, and I won't pull any punches on that score. She was going to be my toast during the minibar.
So let's
got an outstanding record, I think.
Well, let's maybe set this up a little more dramatically, because I think this is really going to be a nomination to watch. In the green corner, Andrea Reimer from Vision Vancouver, endorsed by Zipporah Berman and George Heyman.
Yeah.
And in the green corner, the other green corner, Christine Boyle, one city councillor in the city of Vancouver, presumably endorsed by her husband, Seth Klein. It really is a battle royale of left-wing politics in Vancouver. I mean, I'm going to get the popcorn out. And, I believe that Christine Boyle has not that it's going to extend to political favoritism, but has a close friendship with the premier as well.
Yeah.
So
I distill the bouillon cube even more and say a battle royale of the climate connected politicians in East Vancouver. Like it's these are very close.
Central Vancouver. It's in Central Vancouver.
Central Vancouver.
Central Vancouver. Okay.
I mean, this is
commercial drive adjacent.
I've lived in the same home in Vancouver for 25, 30 years. And I've been in 3 different ridings. I've been in two different ones in the last 2 elections. So where you live is a bit of a movable feast. You can live in the same place and be in many different ridings. But both of them have got reasonable connections to Little Mountain, which is used to be Fairview, but had a piece cut off by the redistribution. It's going to be an elected seat, so it's a front bench opportunity for somebody. I think the issue for
what do you mean it's an elected seat?
I think it's pretty safe. I think it's pretty safe because more, at least the people I talk to, Mike, say that the addition of they lost a bit of negative territory, gained a little bit of other stuff. So we'll see.
As they say in Abbotsford, Jeff, you're counting your turkeys before they hatch.
Yeah, well, I know I don't want to do that, but it's a viable seat. It's one of those ones that's if you're in Vancouver, there's very few vacancies. Let's put it that way.
Turkey chicks.
But I will just add this, that I think the challenge for Christine is that she only ran for office civically in the election last year.
Yeah.
So
she's been
this is her second term. Like,
I see what you mean.
Yeah,
I see.
Like last election.
And I think there was no doubt everybody was disappointed by what I think were foreseeable results after Kennedy's first difficult term. So she's now leaving that, and that would leave. There was
she's formidable
last night.
She's a formidable candidate. One thing I took away from that civic election. She got elected, of course, but it was, ABC didn't.
Do you mean
run.
2018, right? Or do you mean
2022?
2022.
Is that, one city had, when they had their nomination meetings, they had a lot of people out. They have a pretty active network on the left. That's a little different than your typical NDP network, I would guess, Jeff. It's more of an activist based network. So, I mean, she may not have had the time and run time to recruit people for the nomination battle. And I also wonder, though, how many of those members in the riding were signed up by Aperturai in the leadership race that are sitting on that?
Well, I think they would probably have mostly expired unless they all renewed.
Is it a one-year term in the NDP for membership?
Well, you got to keep up re-upping. And so my understanding is that very few of those people did. There was a whole round of constituency elections last fall for constituency leadership, and there was no sign of any Aperturai kind of connection there. Now, there may be some members in that group who re-signed, or people who were existing members who did.
That's
I think it will be hard fought.
Because BC Liberals,
long memories will recall that I sought the nomination against George Heyman there and lost. So I understand trench warfare in Fairview, as it then was called. But I think it'll be very interesting to see. Christine Boyle, has got a letter. There's a letter out from one city saying, "Don't worry, we'll be fine. Even if she wins, we'll be great." But it doesn't feel that way from the tone of the letter.
They'll be fighting each other from their craft beer places down Main Street, I'm sure.
A lot of door knocking, a lot of cappuccino. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting one to watch. I'm excited to watch it as a political observer. Now, the Conservatives, I noticed, have nominated a couple candidates this week, and one of them is the daughter of Stephen Point, former lieutenant governor in Chilliwack. So that got my attention.
And also, the person who'd gone before, the name that cropped up before was Mike Geoghegan, a government consultant in relation, who suddenly disappeared.
Has his own political past. Former NDP staffer who migrated all the way over to the Conservatives in due course.
Yeah.
But I mean, who knows what happened there? I mean, if Stephen Point's daughter presented herself to Mr. Rustad, I'm sure he was all too happy to make a space for her. And then the Conservatives have also nominated in Columbia River a former UFC fighter, Jason Day, I think. Now, what's important there is that Doug Klobuchar recently announced he wasn't going to be running again, I understand, due to some health reasons. Doug's been a real fighter as an MLA, and he won a seat that the BC Liberals weren't supposed to win in 2017, mainly because the incumbent had stepped down, NDP guy, Norm McDonald, was it?
Norm McDonald. Well, I thought that was an election before, but anyway, you're right. Generally speaking,
yeah, but it was an NDP seat. BC Liberals took it in 2017. Basically, Klobuchar had lost in 2013 and then won it in 2017 because he never stopped working for 4 years, which is like pro tip to people who really want to get elected in the legislature. Don't take 4 years off between elections. So, him not running again will be a setback for BC United for sure.
Well, how many are left for BC United? I thought it was just Renee Merrifield undoubtedly will run again, but are there many more to be heard from?
For the incumbents, honestly, I haven't been tracking it as closely as you have, Jeff. So
Well, I
I
think
don't
it's
expect
mostly,
any surprises at this point in terms of
you
people
know, the
not
interesting thing
running.
about the Reimer boys or Boyd
Reimer Boyle.
face off, you know,
Yeah.
is that it's rare. And you've
Yeah.
commented on this earlier, Mike, that there's so many people being appointed and so many just getting acclaimed that we're not going to see too many upheavals or big battles or changes on that front, I think. And there are going to be a significant number of people turnover, I think, on the BC United side based on those who've gone to other levels and so on. The NDP side looks more stable.
Well, we noted there's a nice Donnybrook in Sunshine Coast as well for the NDP. So there's a couple to watch.
There'll be a few, but they don't seem to be that noisy. There's Doug Routley's riding on the island.
There's still a few
Sonia
Vancouver.
Firstnow's left Cowichan and gone down to Beacon Hill, so there may be a race there in Cowichan.
But in Vancouver, I mean, there's that I can't remember what the new names of the seats are, but the Yaletown seat basically, which overlaps with Brenda Bailey's current seat, but then there's South Granville, which also overlaps with Brenda Bailey's current seat. So
yeah, so Brenda Bailey's going to run in South Granville,
right? So that leaves the Yaletown seat up for grabs. So the Yaletown seat could be a consolation prize for Andrea Reimer or Christine Boyle.
True.
Potentially.
Yeah, possibly.
So,
and possibly.
You know, that's happened before in my campaign in 2013. Fraserview became a consolation prize for Suzanne Anton, and it worked out for her. You know, sometimes parties will do that.
All right.
We'll you got to be a dedicated candidate to do that, though.
Well, I think both those women would probably meet that. Let's move it on because I do want to take some time to talk about this report that came out. I believe it's this week on parliamentary culture. It's interesting for a few reasons, I think, you know, including sort of conclusions around requiring mandatory training, you know, around gender and equity, cultural competency, and another kind of interesting curlicue recommendation that the hybrid model of parliament become permanent. Did you get a chance to look at this, Mike?
A little bit. I skimmed it. On the hybrid parliament, I generally support that. I actually more explicitly support it for federal because I think it's so hard for British Columbia politicians to fly back and forth every week and sustain that, and that it's a home wrecker for families on the federal scene. But I think there's an element of that, you know, a significant element of that provincially as well. Even just if you're representing Vancouver and you got to go back and forth on the, you know, floatplane or helijet or whatever a lot. I mean, you got to know that going into the job that you're going to have that pressure. You can't just show up and think like, oh no, look what's happened. But so, I mean, that's just part of the due diligence of making your decision to run. But if there's ways to make it easier, I'm open to that, sure. With the caveat though, that there's nothing really replaces the in-person interactions of being in the legislature. And frankly, in terms of getting stuff done for your constituency, but also being part of the mix, it's, you know, it's tough to do that virtually. So I think optimally, you got to hopefully clear your plate as much as you can to be there in person.
It's interesting to me how much, you know, and these discussions play out in workplaces more broadly. And, you know, I completely agree with your assessment. Like there's really important stuff that's lost. But I worry sometimes about how much we kind of, because of that loss, we sort of don't then turn our attention to how much is gained. And I say this as a working parent who just like, it's a game changer on a given day when I can go watch my daughter do her drum performance. And I mean, literal game changer. And so, you know, again, like I say this too, as a leader at my own workplace who puts a lot of energy actually into thinking about what we're losing because we're not physically together all the time. But I also say it as a mother, and someone with aging parents, you know, whose life is so changed, by the ability to manage some of that with hybrid work. And obviously I think, you know, it just matters so much in representation. So, Yeah, I don't know, Geoff, if that's something that that stuck out for you. Yeah.
Coverage of the report dealt with heckling, and I was interested in Mike de Jong's comments about that. That's what the public and the media think is a big deal, but for the working MLAs, it's very different.
Yeah.
And during the pandemic, this came home in a big way, in big letters, particularly for the working parents, both male and female, but especially female. So I think Katrina Chan was one example. Melanie Mark spoke to this a bit. We see Bowen Ma nursing her child in the legislature, and I at the risk of triggering a whole bunch of outcry, I think that if you think about the kid, you need to provide the support for the whole family and not force parents to bring their kids into the legislature, even if they're quiet and nursing calmly. I mean, to me, that dramatizes how bad it is, really. There's been a long debate at the legislature about providing childcare for legislators, and it hasn't happened because there's a fear among some that the public will say, oh, this is a special perk, even though the daycare could easily be organized to have the children of employees there and other staff, right? So I think it's a good thing, but it speaks to the actual fundamental backwardness of the legislature in so many ways. And it really does need a shakeup. The training that would be mandatory for MLAs, because you can't count on individual caucuses to do it, especially if they're down to 2 members or something, for sexism, racism, abusive treatment is very relevant. They are suddenly cast into employers. They have to run an office. They do HR work. Many of them are not familiar with it. So a larger caucus will have support. Smaller ones do not. There's a lot to know, and mostly it's been restricted to what's the protocol, when do you get to stand up, and all of that kind of thing. So the institution really needs a contemporary makeover, and I'm glad they're dealing with it. I think they're also trying to deal with what to do about reconciliation, and that's a crucial issue that will they have to update a lot of procedures to reflect some of that. They did that in part by putting in some new installations around the edge of the precinct with Lekwungen and Songi's language on it, welcoming language and that kind of stuff. But there's way more to do on that front too. Never mind the fact that the wiring is terrible and it's an earthquake risk, and you name it.
Yes. But is this mandatory training likely to face some resistance, Mike?
Well, I think there's some training that's workplace type stuff that's probably good for MLAs to have, just to be aware of the unique circumstances of the legislature. And for instance, there have been issues in the past over, Mike de Jong mentioned it earlier, like late working hours, and you get lots of people, and I tell you, a lot of these MLAs have a bottle in the cupboard, and it's nice to unwind at the end of the day, and you got to stick around because the house is sitting and people have a few drinks, but then sometimes it can be more than a few drinks, and the staff are there, and understanding that line between elected and staffs gets a little blurry sometimes. So there's definitely that aspect I'm 100% on. My only concern here is how far you go on this. I think they call it mandatory learning. It sounds like a political re-education camp if you took it to the end of the end of the continuum. So it's like at some point you have to know where to draw the line on that stuff, because people are entitled to their own opinions as well. And sometimes people get elected and you don't like what they have to say, but they got elected. So I think you just finding that balance is important.
What people think and what they say are two different things, Mike. And I think the training is important to say to some people, we told you not to say that thing that was on your mind because it was abusive or implicitly racist or whatever it was. So I think it's good to flag. I don't think it's really, we're talking about an hour or two. It will be minimal, I'm sure.
I feel glad that this recommendation is in there. And I feel glad as a woman who was a staffer, and a woman who, I mean, I don't know how much this has changed over time because I've been out for a few years now, but in my time, you'd be hard pressed to find a woman staffer who hadn't had some experience, even if it was just as little as being told, like, just avoid being alone in a room with that person, with that elected. So I'm struggling with it because I think a lot of the times these are cases where no amount of training is going to fix these folks. But the other thing is that I think what people need to understand is folks are elected often without any kind of management experience or any type of this training. And that's fine. That's the public's purview to elect who they elect. But on the other end of that are a diverse set of staffers who hopefully too are becoming more diverse, who then work long hours reporting to those folks and can be put in some positions with a terrible power imbalance. And so I'm glad to see this training happen. I think there's a long way to go in making sure that the people who work for electeds are in a position to speak out and protect themselves.
I think that the critical thing is that everybody knows what procedures and tools they have to support them if a problem arises. And that's for the protection of the MLAs as well as for the staff. And that it was very vague. And certainly during the time I worked in Victoria, most recently, a lot of work was put in by the MLAs to establish those procedures for direct employees of the legislature and constituency association staff who are in a somewhat different category than political staff. But your points are valid right across the board. And Mike's comments about the culture of the legislature, which is in the heading of this thing, is also important. I think that has evolved in a good way. So while undoubtedly there's bottles of scotch cracked open and surprising people huddling around the table at a night session, enjoying a quick drink, I don't know that that's as prominent as it used to be. I mean, we saw the speaker frog marched out of there because of his lax procedures around entertaining and or the clerk, marched out by the speaker because of a whole bunch of policy problems in that area. And I think that since then, a much better standard prevailed on a lot of fronts, and the current clerk is carrying that change on. So we'll see how that works out. But yeah, it's modernizing, but it's painfully slow because it's a consensus process of the MLAs.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we'll continue to watch this one. And I think, ironically now, this is the part of the show where we actually move to go grab a drink.
Last week, I was talking about those cold snaps, when we really need energy to keep us warm and cozy. But it's not just a matter of cranking up the thermostat. It's also about using energy more efficiently. Our sponsor, FortisBC, recently announced it will invest a record $695.8 million to help its customers reduce their energy use over the next 4 years. It's a key pillar in the company's goal to lead the clean energy transformation in BC and reduce consumers' energy use, not to mention bringing down energy costs for consumers and businesses. Efficiency measures make a ton of difference. 740,000 tons, in fact. That's how many tons of CO2 emissions will be reduced over the life of these measures, equivalent to taking more than 228,000 passenger cars off the road. Don't worry, my car's in the garage. I walk to work. These measures are all part of FortisBC's Clean Growth Pathway to 2050, and an important contribution to helping Canada meet its pledge to double energy efficiency by 2030. Hotel Pacifico's window to the world is triple paned, and FortisBC is there to help. Energy for a better BC and a better podcast.
Let's raise a glass or take a shot. Time to raid the minibar.
What's your glass raised to, Geoff?
Well, I was going to raise it to Andrea Reimer. I worked with her for 10 years and we didn't always agree, but I have a tremendous respect for her. She's a unique individual in politics because her lived experience and her story is very, very interesting and compelling, but she really does the work. She campaigns hard. She's a really good organizer, and she would be a great addition to the David Eby team. So that's not a negative comment on Christine Boyle, but just glad to see someone like Andrew prepared to get back into public life. So I think that's good news.
Right.
The brawl for it all. We need to track this every week, this nomination. We want live updates.
Yeah.
Well, I have neither a shot or a glass because I don't think those descriptions really fit mine this week. So I'm just going to say I'm going to shine a light on something here. I just heard in the news in the last day or two that there's been in a First Nation in northern Vancouver Island near Port Hardy, 11 community members have died due to toxic drugs in the last 2 months. And that should be shocking to everybody. Mm-hmm. We all know there's been a drug crisis. We all know that there's just unacceptable number of deaths every month that's going on for years. But in a very small community, everyone will be touched by that and harmed by that. And so, my heart goes out to the First Nation up there, and I know there's a lot of commentary about trying to keep drugs out of the community and all that stuff, and obviously I hope they're more successful, but on that, but it's just is a illustration of how serious this drug crisis is. So
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. That's a great
Yeah.
I just think, we all just need to keep that front of mind.
Yeah. And I think for the three of us, just a good reminder to keep talking about this issue. There's not nearly enough. There's no such thing as too much attention to it. So thanks, Mike. I was actually thinking of that one too. I will pivot. As I had a backup. I will raise a glass. This is going to feel unexpected, but I will raise a glass to Jamil Javani, who just won the by-election in Durham.
Right.
That's Aaron O'Toole's old seat. He's an
interesting cat, this guy.
Exactly. I was just going to say, welcome BC. Folks from Ontario are probably a bit more familiar with him, but he's an interesting one to watch. Try to pick of an example.
So he's elected just to catch up our listeners, he's elected as a Conservative in the Durham by-election on Monday.
Yep. Yeah. Sorry. Pretty safe seat. Kind of, I think, a star candidate for them. An interesting fellow, has held some controversial positions and, has defended Kanye West in the past. And I think will be one to continue to watch. But yes?
Well, I was just going to say, what's interesting about him to me is, first of all, he's immigrant, he's Black, and he has taken positions that are very aligned with Poilievre and against some of the political grain, so to speak.
Yes.
And he was also a university roommate and good friend of Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio. Because he went to Yale with
Yale
him.
Law School.
J.D. Vance wrote Hillbilly Elegy.
Yeah.
And so Jawani's written about that and how that resonated with him and his own experience in Ontario. So anyways, there's a lot to unpack with this guy. He's young.
Yeah.
He'll cut a swath in Canadian politics.
Totally.
On your glass here.
Well, no, but yeah. So I think that's he's one to watch. Look him up if you don't know him already. In coming out with just true to form. He came out after his victory talking about liberal elites and how easy they are to spot and catching and describing them as those who are pushing diversity, equity, and inclusion, environmental, social governance. And I just wanted to raise my glass and say to Jamil Javani, it me. That is a broad swath, including me, of the population. And it'll be interesting to see. He's always so unexpected in how he framed things. He's a good communicator. And so that's it for me. That's it for us this week at Hotel Pacifico. I want to thank our guest Mike de Jong for joining us. I want to thank our presenting sponsors TELUS and Fortis BC. We will see you next week, guests. BC, you can never leave.
Checkout time at Hotel Pacifico. We hope you enjoyed your stay.